My name is Palmer McKay. I'm interviewing Vietnam veteran Linda Caldwell, who served in the Army Nurse Corps and was in Vietnam from 1967 to 1968. Mrs. Caldwell, this interview will have 4 sections: your life before service, basic training, your time in Vietnam, and your life after service. Let's get started with your background. Where did you grow up, and what was your area known for?
I grew up in the military, actually. My father was a career Air Force officer, and so we lived in a lot of different places. But I was born in Yuma, Arizona, and we moved around a lot. So I lived in Texas and Tennessee, France, England, Nevada. I would have to say that Nevada, Las Vegas, is really my home, where I grew up. And I think it goes without saying, it's the gambling capital of the world. So it was kind of unique to go to school there, go to high school there. It was a lot of fun.
Interesting. Can you tell me about your family growing up?
As I said, my dad was, he was an auditor, so he was in the finance part of a base. My mom was a traditional homemaker, and I have one sister who's 8.5 years younger than I am. And so we were, a nice, tight-knit family. My mother's parents both died when she was 17, so I grew up with just one set of grandparents. And my parents were both from Iowa, so we used to spend summers in Iowa visiting my grandparents, mostly.
Do you have any memories of people around you telling war stories from World War II?
Well, both my dad and his brother, my Uncle Wes, were in World War II, but my dad had flat feet and he couldn't march, so they kept him stateside, and he became a cook, which was kind of cool. He used to cook some of our meals. He made legendary vegetable soup and whatever. My uncle was a pilot, but I don't think he was overseas. I don't know exactly all the history of that, but so I don't really remember that. Excuse me, my grandfather was in the army in France in World War I, and he definitely didn't talk about anything that happened there.
Interesting. Did you have a favorite World War II movie growing up?
Favorite movie, I would have to say D-Day. I think that was a movie. That was one, and the one with Tom Hanks and Saving Private Ryan. I guess that was another one that kind of spoke to me.
A lot of Vietnam veteran memoirs mention John Wayne as an influence on their expectations of war. Do you remember John Wayne that way?
No. I remember John Wayne as cowboy movies.
Before Vietnam, where did you go to college and what did you study?
I went to the University of San Francisco and I studied nursing.
And when were you there?
I was there from September of '62 until I graduated in May of '66.
Did you hear anything about Vietnam during your time in college?
Yes, definitely did. It was ramping up, and being on the West Coast, we we're not close proximity, but there were people filtering in and out through the ports and through the airports and whatever going to Vietnam. And I had friends. USF had a ROTC unit, ROTC, and so some of my friends were in the unit, and they were talking about Vietnam as well. So whether they would go or whether they would be drafted or those kinds of things.
Now, I'd like to move on to the start of your service in Medical Field Service School, or MFSS. Could you describe how you enlisted in the military?
Sure. When I was a sophomore at USF, 2 recruiters came to talk to our nursing class, and one from the Army, one from the Navy. And they described a program that was called the Army Student Nurse Program, And in exchange for paying for our last 2 years of college, complete tuition fees, books, and everything, they would require us to spend 3 years on active duty, either the Navy or the Army. And so I thought about it, and I talked it over with my parents, but it was really my decision, and I decided to go into the Army program. The Navy was, I was not familiar with the Navy. The Army ranks were more very similar, are similar, same as the what I was used to with Air Force. So it was a familiarity kind of thing, and it was just a good way to get school paid for. Plus, it sounded like, you know, something adventurous. I was kind of an adventurous type person, so took a chance, and it turned out to be a great decision.
Did you have any female or male role models that encouraged you to enlist?
I guess I'd have to say my father. He didn't encourage it necessarily, but you know, it was a good option. And my uncle, having been in the military as well, so my grandfather.
And did you expect to go to Vietnam?
Not really. It was in the back of my mind, but I wasn't. I didn't join for that reason. Let's put it that way. I just joined for the entire experience of being in the Army, seeing what it was like to be in there myself, having seen what my dad was doing, and you know, it was kind of fun moving around from place to place, not, you know, always living in the same house and have the same friends. You sort of, you learned how to make friends easily, and went to several different schools before I graduated from high school, so.
Did any of your friends enlist with you?
There were quite a few of my classmates, yes. We had a small group because USF was traditionally, it's a Jesuit university, and it was all male until I think 1962 when they admitted females into the college, into the university as the School of Nursing. So we were the only women on campus. So I think we graduated with something like 45 in my class, and a quarter of them joined the military. Either did the same thing I did, either the Army or the Navy.
Interesting. What, if anything, did you know about the country of Vietnam before you enlisted?
I knew that it had been at war for years and years, probably 100 years, and that the French had been there because there was they called her the Angel of Dien Bien Phu. Don't remember her name, but I remember reading about it though, or hearing about it on the news. So that was about the sum total of what I knew. And then what you'd read in the newspaper, the communist, potential takeover of the country and what have you. But I knew very little about it before I went.
Can you elaborate on the Angel of Dien Bien Phu?
She was a nurse, as I recall, and saved a lot of people, soldiers and maybe civilians. But I don't remember a lot of that, just that was part of it.
And what did you know about the Vietnam War?
I guess I would say that it was not a popular war. It wasn't something that everybody was committed to, and there were a lot of protests about Vietnam and our involvement, the U.S. involvement there. But I was actually very naive about it, to be honest. I was focused on my nursing studies, and which were grueling, but didn't really get involved a lot in politics, that kind of thing.
Were there any protests on your campus or in San Francisco while you were there?
Not that I remember, but there could have been. We were, the hippie movement came in right after I graduated, so, because our school was very close to the Haight-Ashbury. I mean, we used to walk down to Haight Street and go to the restaurants and what have you, and shops. And then later to find out, that it was the epicenter of the so-called hippie movement was kind of interesting.
How would you describe your time in medical field service school?
It was 6 weeks of fun and meeting new people and learning so much, about the military. I had a leg up, though, I think, because having grown up in the military, it wasn't as foreign for me as it was for a lot of the people that I was there with. Excuse me. So we learned how to march and how to wear the uniform. We got our uniforms. As an officer, you had to wear, there were different, well, everybody wore, you had Class A uniforms, khakis, and ours was a skirt and a blouse, they called it, so it was a two-piece outfit. And then we had green, Army green uniform, which was more formal, and then we had the actual, very formal, they called it the mess dress. And there was a store in San Antonio called Sugarman's, and that's where we got our uniforms from. And thinking back on it, they were actually tailored for us, which was kind of unusual. But it was interesting. It was also interesting to see the different disciplines that were there at the Medical Field Service School. There were dentists and physicians and veterinarians and optometrists, I believe. So it was a whole conglomeration. But the nurses, we were separate. We had, everybody had their own training. Obviously, they got schooled in different things than we did, but we all had the common thing of, learning how to be an officer and a gentlewoman, I guess you'd say.
Did anyone around you struggle with that transition?
No, not that I remember, no. Uh-uh. Not at that time, maybe later, and I'm sure you'll get to that, but yeah.
I'd like to move on to your time in Vietnam. Did anything stick out about your flight to Vietnam?
It was a charter aircraft. It was a company called World Airways. I don't know if they're still in business or not, and we left from Travis Air Force Base outside of Sacramento, and it was at night. Plane was packed. As I recall, it was a 707 in those days. This was in 1967, November, and we arrived in Vietnam on Thanksgiving Day. So, because you cross the international date line, we didn't leave on Thanksgiving, obviously, but it was packed with mostly men, and there were a couple of women, as I recall. I think I even sat next to one of them, but we had to make an emergency landing somewhere in Alaska to refuel, and then we carried on to Japan, and we were on the ground not long, probably just to refuel and take on food and whatever. But I remember eating 2 Thanksgiving dinners while I was on the plane, so that was interesting. And then coming in to land at Tan Son Nhut outside of Saigon, they warned us ahead of time that it was going to be a very steep descent, because they didn't like to come in low and slow, because it made a very good target for the Viet Cong if they were so inclined. So that was exciting.
Could you describe your first 24 to 48 hours in country?
What I remember of it was landing and getting off the plane, walking over into the terminal, and then getting our bags. And the smells were just very interesting, and they're hard to describe. It was like different foods that you could kind of think that it was a food or whatever, and it was so hot. This was November, it was end of November, and humid, a lot of activity around. And I remember the bus ride to get to Long Binh, which was the in-processing center for the military there. And it took a while, but the bus had wire over the windows, which was something that you weren't really used to doing, and obviously it was done for safety reasons. But I remember getting there and being tired, after a long flight over, I guess it was probably about 12 hours, and excuse me. So sleeping and just trying to acclimate to the time change was for one thing, and then getting processed in, because when you went to Vietnam, you didn't really know where you were going to be stationed. So I couldn't tell my family or my friends, oh yeah, this is where I'm going to be. You didn't know until you got there, and then they assigned you according to what the need was, where the need was greatest. And so I was in Long Binh for a couple of days, and got uniforms, got fatigues and combat boots, not much else. And this was November, and it gets cold in Vietnam in November. That's the rainy season, part of the monsoon season. So it wasn't until I got to my where I was going to be stationed that I actually got a jacket and that kind of thing. And the Army, in its infinite wisdom, because they didn't know where they were going to put us, we all had to bring 8 white uniforms to a war zone, and complete with your nursing cap and shoes and nylons. And so all of that had to be sent back home, and I think that's where I sent it home, was when I was at Long Binh. So I sent it home to my family, because there was one hospital in Vietnam that had a laundry that could do the uniforms. So, and that was the 3rd Field Hospital in Saigon. So I was not selected to stay there, which is fine. Actually turned out to be better where I was anyway. So those had to be sent back. But
were you relieved to be rid of the white uniforms?
Yes, yes, they were nice, but they're definitely not something you could do yourself. They had to go to a laundry because they were starched, and they came back folded. When I was at Walter Reed, at my first duty station after I went to the Medical Field Service School, we just took them to the laundry every week, and they would issue you a new set, and that was the way that worked. So,
what did you expect when you arrived, based on TV or stories you had heard?
I expected to be hot and busy and a lot of military, and I had the advantage of having been in the Army for at least a year, a little over a year, and had worked in the hospital and worked, knew what the routines were, and because every hospital is different and every system has its own quirks and what have you. So I knew that. So it was not unexpected necessarily, but there were a lot of things that had to change, and because we obviously didn't have as many supplies, and we didn't have all of the same equipment that we did stateside. It was a war zone, so it was pared down to what we needed with the basics, I would say.
To back up a little bit, what hospital did you work at before deploying?
At Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington, D.C. That's where I was first assigned. When I went into the Army, when I signed all the papers and whatever, and knew that I was, I had to pass my state boards. So I graduated in May of '66, and then I took the state boards in June, and it took a couple of months before I got my results back. So it was August by the time I went to San Antonio to MFSS, and they tried to give you your first choice of where you wanted to go. And because I'd gone to school on the West Coast, and I grew up in Las Vegas, went to high school in Las Vegas, I decided I'd like to go to the East Coast just to see what it was like, because my dad had never been stationed on the East Coast. Furthest east we were was East Tennessee. And so I thought Walter Reed would be good, and it was wonderful. In fact, that was the nickname that we gave it, was Walter Wonderful.
Wow. Would you describe yourself as being in combat, in the rear, or something else?
Everybody was in combat when you were in Vietnam. There were no front lines. There was no demarcation other than, Hanoi and the DMZ, but demilitarized zone. So you were not a sitting duck, but you were in a dangerous situation regardless of where you were. So that was a misconception that, the nurses were all behind enemy lines. No, we were right there. In fact, there were several nurses that were killed in Vietnam. So not many, but there are about, I think, 8 names on the wall in Washington, D.C., and they were killed for different reasons.
What base were you stationed at?
In Vietnam? I was in Quy Nhon on the coast of the South China Sea. It's south of Da Nang and north of Nha Trang. The town is called Quy Nhon, and I was at the 67th Evac Hospital in Quy Nhon. And there were actually two Army hospitals there, which was kind of unusual. The 85th was across the way. They were closer to the mountains. We were closer to the ocean, the South China Sea rather, and we were right next to the airfield. So it was very convenient in many ways to be that close to the airfield. So.
What kind of work specifically did you do?
Well, when I arrived, I was assigned to a 72-bed surgical unit, and there was a head nurse there, so I was one of the staff nurses. And we worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. You had 1 day off a week. If you worked the day shift was considered 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., and nights were 7 p. to 7 a. If you worked a string of nights, when you got off that shift, like say 5 or 6 in a row, then you got 2 days off. We called it a sleep day and a day off, so that you actually had 2 days off, which was nice. So, and you rotated, everybody but the head nurse rotated between days and nights.
Were you in danger often?
It's hard to say. I was there for the Tet offensive of '68, which I'm sure you've heard about. That's when the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong staged a huge offensive against the Americans. And in every part of Vietnam, it wasn't just limited to, you know, the north or the south or the highlands. So there were 2 nights I can remember where we had to sleep under our bunks and in with a flak jacket on and a steel pot helmet, and that was a little scary. We also had to, because we were right on the airfield, the hospital was, we had to admit patients by candlelight. We had to turn off all the lights because airfields were a prime target for them, and we wanted to minimize the risk, especially to the patients who were in our care. So, but that went on for about 2, maybe 3 days, I guess. Quy Nhon was hit heavily, so after it was all over, we went down, a couple of us went down into the city, and you could see, craters where there had been, and a lot of hand-to-hand combat, so a lot of mortar fire, that kind of thing. So we did a lot of damage.
Do you remember men in the war zone being in additional danger?
They were all, well, our patients would tell us, what happened to them. Yeah. Oh yeah, definitely. It was war. It was, not a romp in the park. It was serious. And it hits you once you're, when you're there for a couple of weeks and you sort of get acclimatized, get used to it. But and the more the stories that they heard or that I heard from them, they were definitely in danger. Obviously, they'd been wounded, so yeah.
For you as a woman, were American men obnoxious or inappropriate ever?
Never. Quite the opposite. They were gentlemen. They were so appreciative. It sounds racist, but they used to say, "You're the first round-eyed woman I've seen in months," and they were always appreciative of any nursing care we did. Just to have somebody to listen to their stories and to talk to them and ask them about their home, what it was like, where'd you grow up, what did you do before you went in the Army, were you in school, were you working, those kinds of things. And we did what we could to lift their spirits as well. And the Army had a lot of regulations about how you wore the uniform, and for nurses, women in the military, you couldn't have your hair on your collar, so you had to have shorter hair or pin it up. You could only wear earrings that were, I had my ears pierced, and you could only wear little stud earrings, nothing dangly, anything, that would detract from the uniform or from your person. It always had to be neat and clean. And, in the morning you get ready and just dab a little perfume on behind your ear and go out to work and try and be a smiling face for somebody who wasn't happy to be where they were.
Did you learn any Vietnamese words or phrases during your tour?
We learned what we call pidgin Vietnamese, and at one point the hospital had hired a Vietnamese language expert, somebody who was Vietnamese, who spoke English, to come and give us classes in the mess hall at night when it was closed down. And it was primarily medical terms and what have you. Vietnamese is a very difficult language to learn, and I wouldn't say that we were very successful, but we picked up a few phrases and mostly, and I did have Vietnamese patients, but so mostly you communicated just by sign language or whatever. We also had, where the nurses' quarters was, we had they call them mama sans, young Vietnamese women who came to the base every day, and they were assigned to different nurses. Like I think there was one mama san for every 2 or 3 nurses, and they would clean our rooms, wash our clothes in cold water every day, and iron. They'd come in the morning and start that very quickly, that process. When it was hot, the clothes would be dry, and they just hung them up. We didn't have a dryer, they hung them up on hangers. But they would press your uniforms and shine your boots, and everything was done by the time they left in the afternoon. So, and for that we paid $10 a month, and they thought that was a good wage in those days. So,
wow.
Yeah.
To back up just a little bit, can you give us a sample of any of the Vietnamese you might have learned?
Bác sĩ was doctor. We learned how to, it was either doctor or captain. I honestly don't remember half of what I learned, which is sad, but when you get older you forget these kinds of things. That's a good question. I should have researched that before I came. Sorry about that.
That's okay. What proportion of your patients would you say were Vietnamese?
A small portion. When I first got to Quy Nhon, to the 67th, and I was on the surgical wards, we had the only neurosurgeon in the area, American doctor. So we got all of the head injuries and quadriplegic prisoner patients. So at the end of my ward, one side, so closest to the door, we had either 2 or 4 beds, depending upon how many patients we had, for those prisoners who had either a spinal cord injury or a head injury. And they were under 24-hour armed guard. So the MPs would sit there, they had chairs and what have you. What was interesting about that situation was the prisoners were very amicable. They weren't hostile. They tried to communicate with us, and we tried the same. Obviously, there were certain things we had to do for them, like change dressings and give medications and injections and that kind of thing. But they were very compliant and very grateful, you would say. What also was interesting was the patients that I had, the American GIs that were ambulatory, would come over to their beds and try and talk to them in what Vietnamese they knew or had picked up. And of course, in those days you could smoke in any hospital bed anywhere in the country, probably, and especially in Vietnam. And so they would offer them cigarettes, and which I thought was very nice of them, and try to communicate with them. And after a while I started thinking, you in that bed are the one who may have shot that one who's being nice to you, and you're all being very nice to each other, so isn't war wonderful? So it was kind of a head game, actually. But it didn't seem to bother, the GIs. There were some that I think probably stayed away from them because they didn't have such good feelings about them. But for the most part, it was an amicable situation. Oh, and then you ask about Vietnamese patients. So I became head nurse of that unit when the head nurse, we had a term, and you've probably heard this, deroast, a date of return to the U.S. And so when he deroast, I took over as head nurse. And I was head nurse for about 8 months. And then the head nurse of the orthopedic unit also deroast, went home. So I asked for and did that because I wanted to change the scenery. I wouldn't say I was bored, but I needed something different to learn, and I was, eager to learn more about orthopedics, which I hadn't had much experience with that. So when I went down to the orthopedic, and I say down because we had a 2-story hospital, there was, it had originally been built as a barracks for the Air Force, and they didn't need it, so they gave it to the Army, and it was ideal because we had a helicopter landing pad right outside of the emergency room, and what they made into an emergency room. So the stretcher bearers, the litter guys, could bring them right into the emergency room and then triage them as to where they needed to go. But my ward was upstairs, and they had built a ramp to get up to the top levels. And orthopedics, because of casts and heavier patients, they were downstairs. So when I went downstairs, I became head nurse of orthopedics. But we had, at one time, I had about 4 children who were patients, Vietnamese children. None of them were war wounds. I had one little girl who had such bad strabismus, meaning her eyes were crossed, that she didn't see a train that was coming. And so she lost contralateral limbs. She lost an arm on one side and a leg on another. She was a delightful little girl, just very compliant. She never cried, she never whimpered, she always had a smile on her face. I had one little girl she was 18 months old. She had pulled an oil lantern over on herself and was horribly burned, starting with her mouth and all the way down her body. She actually lost one of her legs at the hip. She had been treated at the Catholic hospital in Quy Nhon by the nuns, the Vietnamese doctors, but they got her to a certain point and then they couldn't do much more for her, so they brought her to us asking if we could help with that. One of her arms was badly contracted because she'd been burned right around her elbow, and so her arm was like this. So we put casts on it, and the theory is that if you continue changing the cast and under anesthesia and move her arm down, that eventually that will release some of the contractures so that she would have more of a range of motion and function with her arm. But she was a pet. She was absolutely a pet. Somebody found a shopping cart and put a pillow in it, and she was just big enough, and so she would sit in this shopping cart and we'd wheel her around to the different guys' beds and they would entertain her, so which gave us a lot of freer time to do other things that we needed to be doing. So it really looked like pediatrics at one point with these kids, but the guys that were there, that were in their beds, they enjoyed seeing. We called her Cindy, which is terrible because she had been burned to a cinder. Her real name was Nguyen Than Thai Wa, which is a mouthful, but she was just a delightful little girl, and her parents used to come every Sunday and visit her. She had a mom and dad and a brother and sister, and they would come on a Sunday afternoon and sit with her and take her outside and play with her and whatever. So it was nice. I also wrote back to my mom, and her church lady friends sent me clothing for these kids because they didn't have any clothes and they didn't obviously fit into the pajamas that the Army issued to the GIs. So we had a box of clothes, which was nice. Had some. We had one little boy, however, who didn't have a wound. He had a draining ear infection that just would not clear up, and he was a Montagnard child because he had the traditional haircut of Montagnard, the mountain people from the highlands, and he refused to wear any clothes. He ran around buck naked, but we got used to it, and he clearly that was the way he was raised. He didn't wear clothes. So every now and then I used to take him over to the 85th hospital in an ambulance. We'd get an ambulance driver to take us over there because he had to see the ear, nose, and throat physician, the ENT, and he was at that hospital. Orthopedics, or the neurosurgeon was at the 67th, so we traded services back and forth.
Did you have any conflicting feelings about treating enemy prisoners of war?
No. Once a nurse, always a nurse. It's, whoever's in need. It got to me after a while that, like I said, this one could have shot that one and vice versa and whatever, but that's war, You try to be as compassionate as you can and understand that they have families and roles other than, trying to kill Americans and vice versa. Yeah.
How would you describe the people you served with in terms of economic background, race, or religion?
Oh, we had all sorts of, all of the above. We had people from every walk of life. I had a corpsman from East LA, Aguilar, Tony Aguilar, I think his name was, and he used to call me Jefe, the chief, and we had a great relationship with him. We had one who was a conscientious objector, so he had to go into the military, but he came in as a corpsman, so he didn't carry a gun. I had one. There was a group in the military. Your job is considered an MOS. It's military occupational specialty, and so when you met somebody who was like, "Oh, what's your MOS?" And so mine was, I forget what it was, but I was a med-surg nurse. So had 4 numbers. But I had one guy who was what we called a 91C, and that meant that he was equivalent to an LVN or an LPN, somebody who's had a year of nursing school, who can do medicines and whatever. He was phenomenal, and I would like to think that he went on to become either a nurse or a doctor. What some people don't know is that the PA project, the physician's assistant, came out of Vietnam because there were so many corpsmen who were in the operating room and as assistants who became so specialized and so good at what they did that they wanted to further their treatment. So I believe it was Duke University that started the first PA program in the country, but that grew out of Vietnam.
What was the breakdown of the nurses you served with in terms of gender?
Oh, I'd say 95, 98% of them were women. We had, at our hospital, there were 2 nurse anesthetists that were men. When I was at Walter Reed, there were 2 men that I worked with on the neurosurgery unit, but the vast majority were women.
What were your interactions like with doctors?
Very collegial. They saw us as junior doctors, as interns, because we didn't have interns in the Army. And so they relied on us to do a lot of the work that freed them up to do surgery, for the most part. And in fact, the surgeons that I worked with, that I took care of their patients, taught me how to do suturing. So in Vietnam, all war wounds were considered contaminated, and they had to drain for 5 days to presumably rid the body and the wound of infection. Of course, we, put antibiotic ointment and, all kinds of gave them oral antibiotics as well. But you couldn't close a wound for 5 days for fear that it would set up an infectious process, and you get into a lot of trouble with that. So I kept a book as head nurse, and with everybody's name that was, admitted that had a wound that wasn't closed. And on the 5th day, I would, this corpsman who called me Jefe would get the dressing cart, and we'd go bed to bed, and he would be my assistant. We'd both glove, obviously, and use local anesthetic. and I would, suture the wounds together and bandage them up. And then they were ready to go either out of country, or they went to an in-country R&R center, really. Like Cameron Bay had a big R&R center, and you could send, we called them the walking wounded. So if they had a frag wound on their arm or their chest or wherever that wasn't super serious, they could be, after they were sutured, they would be sent to that hospital to recover completely until the wound was completely healed before they would go back out into the field, out in the boonies, as they said. If it was a more serious wound, and obviously the guys from ICU, our job as an evacuation hospital was to get them ready to be evacuated out of country. So when the doctors deemed that they were ready, we would, there was always a flight. There were flights that left, I think, 3 times a week. And we had to get all their paperwork ready, and they would be on the manifest to go either to the Philippines or to Japan. And I'd say probably 99% of ours all went to Japan. I think maybe some of the hospitals further south of us may have gone to the Philippines, but the preferred one for us was to go to Japan. And then they would recover more or go for more extensive surgery if they had to before they were sent back to the States. And they always tried to send them to a hospital closest to where they were from, where their hometown was.
To circle back for just a second, what was the breakdown of your fellow nurses in terms of race?
They were all white. Mm-hmm. Now that I think about it, yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't think I ever worked with, even when I was stateside. I have corpsmen that were black, but nurses, yeah.
Were they from all regions?
Oh yeah, all regions, and all different walks of life, all different schools of nursing. Some were 3 years, because in those days they still had 3-year schools of nursing. They called them hospital schools of nursing. They came in as warrant officers. If you had gone to a baccalaureate program like I did, you came in as a second lieutenant. So, and I actually got my commission in December of my senior year in college, so which was nice. Because then that meant that I had, in the military it's called time and grade, so I had been a second lieutenant for a year when I had only been at Walter Reed for a couple of months. So I got promoted to first lieutenant in December of '67, and then I got promoted to captain while I was in Vietnam. So that was usually about 2 years. You had to be a first lieutenant for 2 years.
How did living in Vietnam and meeting Vietnamese people affect you?
Wow, that's an interesting question. It really shapes a lot of, I think the question also is, how was being in the military in Vietnam, how did that shape you? It made you appreciate what we have in this country. It also made you realize that you could do most anything and suffer through most anything. And excuse me, we used to have a saying when I was there, and also when I came back, what are they going to do to me? Send me to Vietnam? I've already been there. That was considered like the worst of the worst, to have to go to Vietnam, because it was far away from home, it was hot, it was backward. The country itself was very backward. We used to say that it was probably, and this sounds terrible, but that it would probably be better if the communists took over the country, because they would probably improve it. And that proved to be prophetic. But being away from home for a year, it was a hardship, and you counted down the days, especially as you got closer to the time when you were going to go home. But when you look back on it, it was an experience that I would not ever, I don't regret going there. I don't regret volunteering to go there. And a lot of nurses did not volunteer to go there, I have to tell you that. And there were some that had a lot of problems with being there. Fortunately, I wasn't one of those, and I think it had to do a lot with the fact that I grew up in the military. So I knew what to expect. I knew about the rules and the regulations, and you had to do it this way, and this was the Army way to do it, and so on and so forth, which, it really didn't bother me.
What do you remember about non-patient Vietnamese children?
They were sweet. They were, they would always swarm around you and want you to give them candy or money or whatever. But actually, I don't remember seeing a lot of, other than when I went downtown to Quin Yon, which was not very often. I was too busy. When I had a day off, we had a beach, a red beach, that was part of an in-country R&R center. And so we go to the beach, or you go to the PX. But as far as seeing Vietnamese children, I don't remember seeing a lot of them anywhere, other than the patients that I took care of.
How would you describe Vietnamese women, and what did you think of them at the time?
Most of them were very beautiful. They wore these elegant outfits called an áo đai, which was a long sleeve but thin material because it was so hot, for the most part. And they wore them over black slacks, and they were slit up the side, and they wore conical shaped hats, very pretty. And the mama-san that I had was lovely. She was able to communicate with me that she had children. So when my mom sent the clothes for the kids, I gave her some of them for her children. I had to write a note, though, because when they came into the compound, they had to pass through an armed guard, and if they tried to take anything out with them, they were stopped immediately. And so I had to write a note and say, I'm giving this woman, clothing for her children, and sign my name. So then they knew that it was legitimate and that she could keep them. So.
Did you buy an áo đai?
No. I didn't buy anything. The only things I bought in Vietnam, I bought at the PX. And they had very little of anything for women to buy at the PX. They had, every now and then, they would have jewelry. So I have a very nice Mickey Moto pearl ring that I got there. That's also where we would go to buy liquor. They had they call it a Class 6 store, and it was very cheap. And when you wear fatigues, you don't exactly wear a purse or carry a purse, but you had to have something to put your lipstick and your Kleenexes and whatever. So I didn't drink this, still don't, but Crown Royal, the purple bag, that was way back when. That goes back to Vietnam days. And so when whoever was drinking it was finished with it, they'd give them to us to use as we call them ditty bags, and whatever. The Red Cross also had them. They made them and gave them to us. We had a Red Cross worker at our hospital, and she was invaluable. She was one that would get in touch with the GIs and tell them they had a message from home, or if they had birth of a child or a niece or a nephew born while they were there at the hospital, she would inform them of that. Or unfortunately, if there was a death in the family, they also made all of those arrangements to get them back stateside.
Do you remember any distinct animals during your time in Vietnam?
Yes. There was a stray dog that had, somebody on the airfield, one of the pilots had it. I don't know how he found it, but the poor thing had a broken leg. So, and I don't remember who did this, but they kind of set his leg and put some kind of a cast on it. They probably took it over to the orthopedic guys and said, hey, cast this dog's leg. So I remember him, but other than that, not too many animals that I saw.
Were there any rats?
I didn't see any. I was very, and I am and was terrified of snakes. And of course, when you went through the all of the education about before you went there, they gave us a book, and there were pictures of different snakes. It was like, oh God! But fortunately, I never saw any of those.
Did you experience any culture shock in Vietnam?
Oh yeah, it's like I said, it's very, It was in those days. Now it's a highly industrialized, very successful country, obviously. But in those days, it was, more. There were oxen pulling wagons and people out in the fields, doing rice, gathering the rice in the paddies, and so it was not something that you would see in the U.S. The whole thing, and they had these little scooters that they would pile a zillion people, it seemed like, on the back of them, and jitneys. They called them jitneys. That was it. I hadn't thought of that word in a long time. And that was how they transferred, went from place to place, like we would do a taxi. That was their mode of transportation. So.
Did you get sick at all in your time in country?
No, fortunately, I was fine. There were, some people that developed malaria. We had to take every Monday evening when you went to the mess hall for dinner. They had bowls and a spoon. They had 2 bowls. One was chloroquine, one was primaquine, and that was the malaria prophylaxis. And you had to take them. Unfortunately, they had side effects, and so people would take them and then throw them away. But I tried to be compliant because I didn't want to come down with malaria. But no, I was, knock on wood, I was healthy.
What was the most interesting food you ate in Vietnam?
I guess one time we went down to to a restaurant in Vietnam, or in Quy Nhon, but I think it was actually a Korean restaurant. And we had kimchi, which I guess was probably the most interesting thing I had while I was there. What I didn't have was, in the mess hall, we didn't have salad, we didn't have real milk, we didn't have ice cream, but the Navy did. And there was a Navy base in the bay outside, because Quy Nhon being right on the water, there was a Navy base there. And so a couple of times the Navy officers invited some of the nurses to come over and join them for Sunday dinner during the day. And it was like, wow, ice cream. We hadn't seen that. So that was about the most interesting thing I had.
Did you ever see Vietnamese civilians collecting or using American trash?
They used to make things with American trash. They used beer cans and made signs, and they used rubber tires, old rubber tires, to make sandals and, what have you. But I don't know that I saw them picking up any trash per se. We didn't have a lot of contact. In a hospital, you're very isolated. I was thinking about that a while ago, that we didn't really know what was going on in other parts of Vietnam. We didn't know how the war was going. We had, the radio station, but, you weren't glued to it. You were too busy taking care of 72 patients at a time. So we didn't really know where they were. I do remember hearing that Lyndon Johnson's speech, and I don't know where I would have heard this, that he would not accept the nomination for president to be reelected. And people were like, wow, I wonder who's going to do that and how's that going to go? But that was about it. I also do remember when I was there in December, I had just been in country for a couple of weeks, and it was the Army-Navy football game. Only we listened to it at night because of the time change, the time difference, and somebody had a radio, so we listened to it that night. It was kind of fun.
To back up a little bit, do you remember what the nurse-patient ratio was during the time?
Well, I do know that we didn't have enough nurses to have 3 shifts, so we tried that at one time. But at any given time, because the way the ward was situated, and keeping in mind that it was supposed to have been a barracks, so it was built in an H. So there were 2 long rows on each side of this structure where my ward was, connected by a hallway. So you had 32 beds on one side, 32 on the other, so 74 altogether. Or no. Anyway, there was 72 beds. I do remember that. So you do the math. But on any given time, we would probably have 2 nurses on one side and 2 on the other, and maybe somebody floating in between. So it was a high nurse to patient ratio. But also keeping in mind that a lot of them were walking wounded, so they weren't as seriously injured. Now down in ICU, which was downstairs from us, the ratio was, I think, 1 nurse for 2 patients, something like that. They tried to keep a lot more nurses down there, which meant that because they only had a certain number, and I don't remember how many total nurses there were, because we also had on the other side of the street, because there was a dirt road in between these 2 structures, that was the medical side. So guys that had dysentery or malaria or a non-surgical condition, they would be on that side. So those nurses, they had to staff that area as well. So, and the OR, of course, the operating room had a large number of nurses staffing that.
Do you remember seeing Agent Orange being sprayed?
No, but we were in the area where it was sprayed. So I'm quite sure that it came in on the clothes of the guys when they were admitted to our wards. And the protocol there was you always, if they were walking and could go in, they would go into the latrine and take a shower if they didn't have huge gaping wounds. Sometimes even if they did, because the theory being that the soap and water would help wash away the bacteria. But then they would put their clothes in a plastic bag and it would have their name on it. So all that, if they were sprayed, it was all right there, and we were exposed to it too. Yeah.
Were you concerned at the time
No.
about Agent Orange?
Probably didn't really know that it was being done. It wasn't until afterwards. That wasn't something that was widely known. I mean, it was, if you read the newspapers or, whatever, saw the pictures, yeah. But like I said, we were too busy focused on what our job was.
What were some of the ways you coped with the war?
We had parties when you weren't working, when you had your 12 hours off. We had the supply sergeants were wonderful. We never knew where they came from, but they would get cases of steaks from someone. They'd trade back and forth. There was like a network of sergeants and supply people, and they'd make friends with the pilots. And so the pilots coming in would bring in a case of steaks or a couple of cases or whatever. And there was a barbecue area where we would have, and it was all comers. It was not, just limited to the officers, and so we would party and whatever, although there were parties that the nurses' quarters that were strictly just for the nurses and for the doctors and whatever. But as I said, I would go during the day. I would go on my off time down to the PX and mainly just to get out of the compound, see another face or another part of the area of Quinyon. Sometimes we would go downtown. Not very often, but they had flea markets, and you could see sun-kissed oranges and Q-Tex nail polish. That was a brand that was popular back in the 60s. You could see that being sold in the black market, meaning that it had been originally destined to come to the military, but had been diverted with the black market, which was angering, enough to annoy everybody. The Army, and speaking of that, the Army was ill-equipped to have women in a combat zone. We had no, like I said, jackets that were appropriate, sized for women. So we had to, take what we could. And supply sergeants did a great job with that. We had no sanitary supplies for women. And you were at the mercy of your family or friends to send that to you in the mail. We used the Sears catalog a lot because when you weren't wearing fatigues and combat boots, you didn't want to wear them 24/7. So we did have clothing, and you buy something out of the Sears catalog and order it. It was a long process because as I recall, it wasn't a credit card situation. It was write out a check and mail it, and then, a month later you might get something in the mail. But it was interesting.
Did the PX not stock?
Nothing. As I said, I think the sum total of what I bought there was a pearl ring, and I don't even remember, just maybe the liquor. That was it. I don't even remember what I drank in those days.
Wow. Do you remember humor or slang or jokes being a part of life in Vietnam?
Oh yeah. And when somebody was within 30 days of going home, if you saw them walking on the compound, you'd yell out, "Short!" And it was fun. It was like, I'm short. I have a short time left in this country, and I'm leaving. And yeah, there were, you tried to make the best of a bad situation. That people asked me if MASH, the show MASH, if that was akin to what we went through, and I said yes, in the sense that you did what you could to make it fun, and war is not fun, but to take your mind off of things, to forget that there are people dying, and I was fortunate in what I did that my patients didn't die. They walked out, or they rode out in a stretcher and went home. But that wasn't the case with others, and there were a lot of nurses who were affected badly by that.
Did you or anyone you served with change in terms of faith in Vietnam?
That's an interesting question. I don't think so. No. Mm-mm.
Were you aware of active duty nurses or other military personnel who opposed the war?
If they did, they didn't broadcast it. I mean, like I said, when we were, one night, or sitting around being philosophical and saying, these people are backward. They need, as far as sanitation and medication and just, how to earn a living and those kinds of things needed to be brought into the 20th century. But I don't think it, no, that was not something that we really waxed philosophic about.
What was the most memorable friendship you had during your time in Vietnam?
Well, there was a patient that I took care of on the orthopedic unit, and he was 19 years old. He had been married 5 months to the day that his leg was blown off, and we were getting him ready to go, to be evacuated to Japan. And I had a rule as the head nurse that you had to write a letter home to your family, your wife, your spouse, your girlfriend, whatever, and let them know that you were okay, because there was no other way to communicate. We didn't have cell phones, we didn't have computers. The phones were the military system, and you were only to be used in an emergency. So anyway, he was struggling with writing this letter, and I said to him, would it make you feel better if I wrote a letter to your wife? And he said yes. So I sat down, and I remember this because he was on my left and I was here. And it was hard for me to do this because I thought, what is she going to say? He was 19, she was 18, I think, 18 or 19. How is she going to cope with somebody? And in those days, I mean, losing a limb was a big deal. Now, with Iraq and Afghanistan and everything that went on over there, it's, small potatoes compared to what some of them went through and the traumatic brain injuries and whatever. But it was still, a trauma that she was going to have to deal with. So I wrote this letter, and it was hard to do, but I put it in an envelope, and we put it with his letter. And Polaroid cameras had just come into being, the little swingers, and so one of the corpsmen took a picture of me, and we put that in there, and he wanted to do that, and sent it off and forgot about it. In 1990, in March of 1990, I was watching the show Unsolved Mysteries, and Robert Stack came on and said, next week we'll show the story of a young Vietnam veteran who for 30 years or 20 years has been looking for the nurse who saved him physically and mentally. And her name is Linda Sharp. And that was my maiden name. So I looked at my husband and I said, it must be somebody else. Sharp's a common name. A lot of Linda Sharps out there. So we lived in New Jersey at the time, and the show went off the air. So I called my sister, who lived in Las Vegas, and I said, watch this show when it comes on and call me back and give me the 800 number. So I called, and they said, you're who we're looking for. They asked me a couple of questions. Did I remember this name? And I said, absolutely, I remember this name. And it was Jim Bukowski. And so, long story short, we were reunited. He was living in Grand Junction, Colorado, and NBC flew me out there from New Jersey, and we filmed an episode of Unsolved Mysteries. And so they showed it in May of that year, and it's now on YouTube. It's called Thanks, Captain Sharp, and it shows a different side of Vietnam and the war, and the aftermath of it. And he suffered from PTSD. He, at one point, after he got out of Fitzsimmons Hospital in Denver, is the amputee center it was then, and he was from Denver, so ironically that's where he got sent after he got back from Vietnam and out of Japan. And we got a picture, he sent us a picture back to the ward of him on skis, so we knew that he made it and that he was doing well, which was so heartwarming. But then to see this show and to hear his perceptions of what it was like to be a patient of ours was just amazing, absolutely amazing. Unfortunately, he died in 1999, but we kept in touch, and I got to go to his graduation from college. He went to Mesa College in Grand Junction and got a degree in counseling, and he wanted to be a counselor for other veterans, but at the time he graduated, there were no positions available. So he sort of stagnated, and he began drinking. And at one point he, was off the booze, but he went back to it. And they had told him when he was wounded that he would probably never have children, because in addition to his right leg, he lost his right testicle. But he went on to have 2 children, 2 boys, and he had 3 grandsons, and 2 or 3 grandsons. Anyway, but I still keep in touch with his widow, and so that's a lasting friendship from Vietnam.
Thank you for sharing that story.
Sure.
What was the most beautiful thing you saw in Vietnam?
Well, another experience I had that I guess I would say was beautiful was I got to go to the Bob Hope Christmas show. And it was highly illegal because it was out in the valley from our hospital, and it was known to be a hangout for the VC. But this other nurse and I went. There was a colonel who had a Jeep and a driver, and he didn't go, but the driver took us out there. And when we got there, there were probably at least 1,000 GIs in this area. Everybody's sitting on the ground, and there was a stage way up in the distance. And so Jerry and I sat down. Her name was Geraldine. And we sat down, and the guys said to us, no, keep going, go on up, go on up. And so every time we would sit down, they would keep saying, go on up, go further. So we ended up sitting ringside. We sat right below the stage, and actually, Bob Hope used to do a montage of all of his shows, and he'd put it on TV in January. And so my parents actually saw me in one of the clips. But the most beautiful thing of that was at the end of his show, he always closed with White Christmas. And to hear, there had to have been 2,000 people watching him and singing White Christmas. It's something I'll never forget. It was just an amazing, it was beautiful.
Wow. What was the worst thing you saw in Vietnam?
One day I was walking through the OR corridor to go to ICU for some reason, and I happened to look into one of the windows of the OR, and there was a patient there who was as black as that door over there. He had been burned. He was obviously anesthetized, but that brings it home, because especially when you're used to dealing with people who can walk and talk to you as patients, and some of them could walk. I'm not saying that they were all ambulatory, but anyway, but to see something like that, it just really brought it home. The other thing that brought it home to me was after I got home from Vietnam and after I got out of the Army, I saw the movie Platoon, and that was a huge eye-opener for me. I never realized, like I said, we were very isolated. When you're in a war zone like that and you're in a fixed position, you don't move around, all you know is what you see. You don't know what anybody else is going through or what it was like out in the field. I mean, the guys would tell you, but that movie was incredibly done, well done. And it really made me realize how much, when the guys would come in and talk to me, how important that was for them to unload and talk about that, how important it was for them to take a shower. I mean, that was just, you know, a huge luxury.
Did you expect to survive the war?
Yes. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Who did you write to or receive letters from when you were in Vietnam?
My parents, my grandmother, a family that I had lived with when I was going to college. For my last 2 years, I didn't live in the dorm. I lived with, it was actually my boyfriend's family, and his aunt and uncle, and so I heard from them. That was about it. Yeah.
Do you remember any American TV shows or songs from your time in Vietnam?
Oh, yeah. We Got to Get Out of This Place. I forget who sings that, The Doors, maybe?
The Animals?
Animals, thank you, thank you. There were some others, too. If you see the movie with Robin Williams, Good Morning Vietnam, those songs were all In the Heat of the Jungle, and that was We Got to Get Out of This Place. Any of those songs, that was some of the Creedence Clearwater songs, I think, were popular then. But yeah, there are things like that that when I hear that, that brings me back. There's also, and I'm sure in other interviews you've done with Vietnam veterans, the sound of a helicopter with the blades, that just takes me right back. And about the only negative thing that I have from my time over there is if I hear a loud, unexpected noise, that bothers me. Like if somebody were to slam a door right now, I'd probably jump. But I mean, that could be just anybody too. That's not necessarily a war sequela, but you know, that's what I remember.
What was R&R like, and where did you go?
R&R, I went to Bangkok, but for leave, you could take a 5-day leave, and you were entitled to an R&R. So the theory was, and people would say to you, well, take your leave first, because they have to give you R&R, but they don't have to give you leave. So I took leave first, and I went to Hong Kong, and that was amazing. And I thought I had a tan, and when I took a shower in hot water, it kind of came off, so it was dirt. Because in the nurses' quarters at our hospital, we didn't have any hot water. We had cold water. So picture taking a cold shower every day and washing your hair in cold water. We had hot water in the hospital, and the doctors used to come up every night. They'd come up if you were working nights or whatever, and they'd say, "Hey, Linda, how are you?" And, "Hi, Herb, how are you?" And they would go in and use the latrines and take hot showers. It never once occurred to us as nurses that we should shut down the latrines one night a week. Just one night would be nice to take a hot shower. We never did that.
That's the end of my service questions. Is there another story we haven't talked about from your time in Vietnam that you'd like to share?
One of the things that, if you've ever watched the show China Beach, the TV show was popular in the 80s and 90s, I guess. There's a story about a young, the Donut Dolly, and she dies. And when they take her out, they put her on a plane, and there are caskets there. When I went home from Vietnam, when you went home from Vietnam, if you left out of Da Nang, you went on a commercial flight and you flew into Seattle, Tacoma. I didn't want to do that because I wanted to go back to San Francisco, mainly because I was going home in December, and I wanted to see some of my friends that still lived in the Bay Area before I went home to Las Vegas to go for Christmas. So I finagled a way to go out of Cameron Bay, but it was on a military flight, on an Air Force plane. So when I walked out the morning that I was leaving, and because it was a military flight, I was dressed in my combat boots and my fatigues. And I looked at this huge plane, it was a C-141, I think, and it was filled from top to bottom with caskets. So when I saw years later that scene from China Beach, I thought, wow, they must have been inside my head, because it was me and about 5 or 6 other GIs going home on this commercial flight, or a military flight, excuse me, and then all of these caskets. And the pilots used to have a phrase that they said, bullets in and bodies out. So it really brought home that unfortunately we didn't get to save everybody. So, but that's probably about what I remember. I mean, we had good times, but you can't say that war was good, but it was an interesting time. And had I had the opportunity to do it again, I would have done it in a heartbeat.
Let's talk about your post-service life. What relationship in your life was most changed by your service?
I guess with my parents, excuse me, sorry, I don't know that it was really changed, though, because I was in the military before I ever went to Vietnam.
How did your service change your career trajectory or expectations?
Well, because we did things in Vietnam that nurses in the U.S. weren't allowed to, or licensed to do, it was sometimes difficult because I'd been doing suturing and assessing a patient and ordering my own lab tests and x-rays. There was one patient who came in who didn't really look good, and his blood pressure was a little wonky. So I ordered a complete blood count and an x-ray of his abdomen, and it turns out he had a ruptured spleen. So when I called the doctor and said to him, hey Herb, go over and look at this kid's x-ray, and he called me back, he said, prep him for surgery, he's got a ruptured spleen. Those were not things that you would do as a nurse. It was very much more restricted. Hanging a unit of blood. I ordered blood. It was like, yeah, this kid is low, his hematocrit's low, he needs a unit of blood. So you had that collegial relationship with the doctors that you knew that they would cover you. They would write the order and say, yeah, this is what I ordered. So when I came back, I was ever so much more confident as a nurse. Now, I came back in 1968 and I graduated in 66, so I'd been a nurse for 2.5 years. So it gave me a lot of, like I said, confidence and being able to look at a situation and assess not only the situation but the patient, and kind of figure out what treatment path this should take. That was a huge plus. And as I said, I had the luxury that I had another 9 months left in the Army. So I was at Letterman Army Medical Center in San Francisco, and I was head nurse of a neurosurgery unit. And probably about 90% of my patients had either head injuries or spinal cord injuries. And so I could talk with them, and we all spoke the same language, so to speak. But it gave me confidence when I got out of the military to go into, I started working first in an ICU, and then I finally decided, once I got married and moved to New Jersey, that I really needed to use my GI Bill. So that was the real trajectory my career took. And I got my master's at Rutgers University in New Jersey and started working as a clinical specialist in oncology, which was another kind of similar to military nursing in that you're fighting a war against cancer. And so it just gave you a lot more confidence. I treasure my time in the military. And not just because I grew up in the military too, but I think being there and being a nurse, it's a totally different kind of an experience to do as far as nursing goes.
To circle back, did you know any anti-war veterans?
No.
Did you participate in any veterans rap groups or Agent Orange studies or use the GI Bill?
I did use the GI Bill. As I said, I got my master's in that. There was, at Rutgers, there was the veterans office, so where all veteran students would go. And there were a couple of other nurses, and that's probably the first time I ever met anybody else that, had been in Vietnam or was, in the military as far as women go. Because there wasn't really anything very organized. And the veteran service organizations really weren't, they would look at you like, you were in the military, really? I didn't have time. I was too busy. I was married and I had 3 kids and I was going to school, so I didn't have time to join anything like that. But I often said, and my husband teased me and he said, we should just go to the VFW and see what they would say. But we did later on. But anyway, we'll get to that.
Who since the war have you talked to about Vietnam?
In 1993, we were living in New Jersey, and the Vietnam Women's Memorial was being dedicated in Washington, D.C. So my husband and I and 2 of our 3 children decided that we would go down and, spend a couple of days there and see, be there for the dedication. Our oldest daughter was a freshman at Syracuse, so she couldn't go, but it was amazing. We got there and we didn't know what to expect, didn't know how many people were going to be there. The Constitution Avenue was packed with people. We had parked our car and we were walking, and so I said, well, let's just walk up here and a little ways. And all of a sudden I saw a banner and it said 67th Evac Hospital, Quinh Nhan, Vietnam, and I thought, oh my goodness. So I saw nurses that I hadn't seen since 1968, and this was in 93, so it was really, really a heartwarming experience. That night, they had a dance at a big area somewhere in Washington, D.C. I can't remember exactly where it was. It was called the Delta to the DMZ, and those were 2 areas. So the Delta was down in the south of Vietnam, and the DMZ was up north. And it was a lot of fun to see people. And what was really heartwarming was a lot of the audience and the people participating, because we did a parade then, and they were all like, oh, come on, let's, come with us. And with this banner and everything, so we marched down Constitution Avenue, and but there were people, guys, that would come up to you and thank you and say, thank you for saving our lives and, for being there for us and whatever. It was just very, very heartwarming. That was a tremendous experience. I'm so glad I went.
Have your views on the war changed since 1968?
Oh, yeah. When I went over there, I thought, oh yeah, this is great. We're going to save this country from communism, and we're doing a good thing and whatever. And I realized later on, having read books like The Bright Shining Lie and different things like that, how futile it was and how misled the military was by the politicians in Washington, as often is the case, that we never should have been there in the first place. They had been at war for hundreds of years, and our efforts were not going to stem the tide of communism. And as I said before a couple of times, it turned out that they were better off becoming a communist country, in my view. I'm sure there are plenty of them that don't feel that way, but they've at least become an industrialized nation and, have jobs for their people and, are bringing them out of poverty and teaching them things like hygiene and medicines and, how to take care of children and what have you.
Having been to the wall in D.C., what did you think of it?
It was awesome. Absolutely awe-inspiring monument. And I remember at the time when they were having the contest to decide who was going to design it. And when this design was chosen, it was universally, people were just adamantly opposed to it. They thought it was awful, that it was a scar on the landscape and whatever. When you actually saw, I didn't feel that way, but when I saw it, I thought, this is so fitting and it's so beautifully done and beautifully thought out that young woman who designed it was genius.
And what did you think of the nursing memorial?
Again, very, very well done. It's beautifully done, and it's in a nice setting, and couldn't be prouder of it. The woman who really got that going was Diane Carlson Evans, who was a nurse in Vietnam, an Army nurse, and she's the one who came up with the idea that there should be a monument to the nurses. So I give her all credit for doing that.
Have you been back to Vietnam?
No, but I would love to.
Why?
I'd like to see the changes that have come about and see how the people are. I've heard, in fact, I have a good friend who just was there a couple of weeks ago. She's on her way home now, but I'm anxious to hear what her interpretations are of it and how it looks and whatever. We used to say when we were there that this is a beautiful country and it'd be a great place to come if there wasn't a war going on. Because it's gorgeous, absolutely lush and beautiful flowers and just a beautiful, beautiful landscape.
This is my last question. Do you have a favorite book, poem, or movie about Vietnam?
I guess Platoon would have to be my favorite movie. A lot of people ask me about the book The Women that came out about 2 years ago by Kristen Hanna, and I've done probably no less than 8 book clubs here in this area. People ask me, to come and talk to them after they've read the book and discuss my time there. And I always say it's part soap opera and it's part true, and it's part, romance novel. But I think what it did was it put a spotlight on the fact that there were women in combat back in Vietnam, and that what we did was important and had meaning and really shaped the way things were done going forward. I mean, from each war you learn, unfortunately, you learn lessons at the expense of others and people who die. But one of the things in Vietnam that came out was the use of helicopters to ferry the wounded in a very quick from the battlefield to a hospital. And that came out of Korea. So, pardon me, because the Vietnam veterans, not myself, but weren't treated very well, I think the experience in Iraq was much better for them than it was for us, and as it should be.
Have you ever read Home Before Morning?
Yes, I did. And I didn't enjoy it because I think it was, I don't know how to say this in a nice way, but I think she clearly had psychiatric issues, probably before she ever went to Vietnam, Linda Van Deventer. And I don't think it gave a very accurate description of a lot of things that were there. I remember reading it and saying, no. and saying, I really should write something, but I haven't gotten around to that yet. Maybe one of these days I will.
Well, Mrs. Caldwell, thank you so much for talking with us and
You're
sharing
welcome.
your stories.
Thank you, Palmer. It was a joy.